This is Stephen Kotler, and you're listening to Your Superior Self.
Hi, this is Rod Goddess, and I am rolling with Your Superior Self.
Hi, this is Dave Meltzer, and this is Your Superior Self.
Hey, this is Brant Menzwar, and you are listening to Your Superior Self.
Hi, this is Paul Selig, and this is Your Superior Self.
What's up, everybody? I'm Aubrey Marcus, and this is Your Superior Self.
What is up, beautiful people? Welcome back. I'm Trey Downs, and this is Your Superior Self. Thank you for taking the time to download today. Thank you for taking the time to hang out with me and today's guest, Stephen Kotler, on today's episode. He is a force to be reckoned with in the world of flow states. I'm excited. And you guys are probably thinking, why are you doing that? Well, Stephen and I talk about that. It's called reframing. And it's what he does every time before he gets up to speak. He says that phrase, I'm excited, 3 times. And he discusses why. He talks about the science behind it, what reframing is and how it can be beneficial in our lives, how we can use it in certain situations that are fear-based. What is going on in our life that is causing us fear, and by reframing things, we can change it around on itself. He talks about that. I highly suggest that you go and check out his Creative Live course on creativelive.com. It is an investment that I see the returns on investment every day that I do this podcast, because he does a special class, master class on creativity. I have like so many quotes on my whiteboard from him. I am excited 3 times. That's one. Do I have enough? Do I have enough information on what I want to talk about? Basically, what is the payoff? What is the payoff of what the project that I'm currently doing? What is the payoff of that? And what will be the result of crushing your goal? These are all things that he tells or asks himself before doing any type of project, especially when you have to speak in front of people, which could be very intimidating. It's the number one fear, I think, most Americans. Number 2 is death. So he definitely psychs himself up by going through this list, as do I whenever I have a huge interview. And then continuing on, he talks about saying to himself, reframing, you are welcome, because everyone feels like they are not welcome whenever they go to something that they are uncomfortable with, or speaking in front of people, or doing something that is outside of their comfort zone. And then saying to yourself, you are wanted and you are here to help. And I say these things to myself right before any type of big interview, because let's face it, we are, people that are creative. We're continuously putting ourselves out there for the world, and it can be intimidating. And it's an opportunity for ourselves to kind of reframe that fear and come in with some motivation and some momentum into the certain situation that we're finding ourselves in. I actually did it before this interview because Stephen Kotler is I'm a huge fan of his and his work. I met him at a conference, or there was an event my brother-in-law Joe put together, titled Complicated Conversations, and we actually hung out for a little bit. And I didn't know who Stephen Kotler was. I watched one of his, he was speaking that day, and that was the first time I ever was introduced to his content, or his thoughts on flow, or his theories on flow. And I was intrigued. I was amazed. Right? Like I say in the interview, I'm very intrigued by data, and he brings that with him wherever he talks about flow, and it got me right away and hook, line, and sinker. And then so like throughout the event, I was just kind of like trying to get some time with him to show some face and speak about my mission and what I'm trying to do with the podcast. And I asked him a lot of questions about flow, and he was a cool guy. He was awesome. He was willing to speak and give me as much time as I needed. And then he pulled out some tobacco and wrapped his own cigarette, and I was like, yeah, you're a badass. Yeah, I need to get all of your books right now and read up more on what you're about. But yeah, here's a little preview of our discussion. It is pretty intense, and it's very intriguing.
oh my God, I finally got like a little bit of opportunity to do exactly what I came to do. What it felt like I came to do. And if you see that, you know what I mean? If you bump into that, if you're lucky enough to bump into that at any point in your life, you run straight towards that thing with everything you got until something kills you. Because those opportunities, those moments, you get, as far as I can tell in my life, I don't know about other people, but I find one a decade.
That's some really good advice. And here's some other free advice, really good advice as well. You should go pick up his book, The Art of Impossible, because it's already hitting bestseller lists. I think it's New York Times bestseller, Wall Street bestseller, LA Times bestseller, Washington Post. What else is there? The Southern California Indie bestseller list and USA Today bestseller list. That is amazing. I cannot wait to get my hands on a copy, and I highly suggest that you go out and buy yours today. You can find out more about Stephen by going to StephenKotler.com, reading all of his content that he has over there. He mentions that there is there's probably a ton of rabbit holes you can go down as far as the data that he has collected over the years on flow states and consciousness. And then also you can find out more about him through his podcasts and his videos. He was on Joe Rogan Experience. And he has a ton of material over there that I highly suggest you go check out, because it will help you understand creativity and flow states and how you can leverage more creativity in your life and create more flow states that will help you, with your projects or your art or whatever you're inspiring to put out into the world. Highly suggest that. Before we get into it, though, please follow me on Instagram at tdowns80. Check me out on the website, traydowns.com. Got some stuff over there for you guys to check out. Also, Facebook, social media, all that good stuff. I'm over there if you want to follow. Make sure to hit subscribe and leave a rating and a review wherever you get your podcast from. It helps me scale this and helps me get this out to those who may need it the most. So, yeah, I'm excited. Without further ado, here's my conversation with the great and powerful Stephen Kotler.
This is Stephen Kotler, and you're listening to Your Superior Self.
Stephen, my man, thank you so much for joining the show. This is like, a dream come true, because like you're one of my favorite authors, and I just love everything that you're about.
I appreciate that, Trey.
Yeah, man. So are you currently working on a new book? I feel like, we had scheduled this later in the fall because I thought you might have been working on a new project. Is that true?
So we saw each other when 7 months ago, 8 months, pre-COVID,
like
right?
Ago. Yeah.
So I've written since then. I've written 2 books.
Wow, really?
Yeah. They were in the works when one of them was in the works when we were together. The Art of Impossible, which is a book I have coming out in January, which is literally almost everything I've ever learned about human peak performance assembled into a how-to book. And then I wrote a novel. So I write novels, and I wrote a second part to wrote a recent book called Last Hang on Cyberspace, and I wrote a part 2.
My favorite book is, I think it has to be Stealing Fire. Like, I love that book. I can tell your writing style like immediately, because I like I'm like a data whore. Like, I just love data, and like you tie like these fantastic stories into data and make it easily explainable for the readers, which always like pulls me in. And I mean, you just have this unique ability to do that.
Thank you, I guess.
So talk about, like, you're from Cleveland, right? Like, that's where it all started.
Chicago, and I grew up in Cleveland.
Nice. And we had a little conversation about like you were bartending. I think it was like Skid Row, I think it was called.
Yeah, no, I was I was a bartender on and off for a long time, like through college and grad school and such. And I started working when I was 11. But by the time I was sort of like, I think it was between freshman and sophomore year in college, I was bartending at I did a dawn shift at one of the steel mill bars. And, this was at the time that industry wasn't doing so well, and Cleveland was rough. People were throwing themselves off bridges, all Pittsburgh and Cleveland. And, got really hit hard. And I mean, downtown Cleveland, most of Cleveland was a ghost town when I was growing up. Like we used to have huge drag races through downtown Cleveland because it was like 7 square miles of emptiness because it burned to the ground and they never rebuilt it. Kind of a wasteland.
Jesus. But you met a lot of cool people back then. I mean, a lot of creative people came out of there.
Yeah, amazing people. So I always say, if you were a weirdo in Cleveland, and that basically meant everything from like, you could be a punk rocker, you could be into new wave, you could have been a hippie, a deadhead, you could have been a communist, a transvestite, a comic book artist, a magician, didn't matter. Cleveland was a very conservative place. And if you didn't fit, you congregated, if you lived on the east side where I did, to one like 5-block stretch known as Coventry. And, there were a couple of head shops. I think it was a communist bookstore and, there was the coffee shop Arabica that drew everybody in. And, but it was, I always say like, I work on flow, and I always say like one of my early introductions to the power of this state of consciousness was that group of people, because it was a rough, it was Cleveland. It was a tough crowd. A lot of people had drug problems. A lot of people had booze problems. A lot of people were in and out of jail for serious stuff. A lot of people died. And yet this little 5-block area produced a couple of different Emmy Award winning cinematographers, myself, a couple other writers, comic book artist Harvey Pekar, bands like Sepultura, 9 Inch Nails, Filter, the list really goes on. There was like 40 or 50 sort of like cultural shaping influencers who came out of this like one little area. And if you would have like asked anybody back when you were looking at us between the ages of 18 and 25, like pick a group of people guaranteed to fail, right? And they would have pointed right at us. We were everybody's, number one choice for like, you're never going to live to see 25. And I had a 6th grade teacher who told me I wouldn't live to see 30. So like, this wasn't surprising. And yet when you take a group of really creative people and you bond them together and they got each other's backs and they're doing things that create a lot of flow, you can accomplish really incredible things. Just amazing heights of creativity and innovation and creativity, and which was what that really generated for me. So yeah, that was Cleveland a little bit.
Sounds like an amazing time. Like when did you start? Like when did you want to be a journalist, or when did you want to start? I mean, I literally, my grandmother, wrote poetry, quote unquote, right? Like she wrote what now we might consider like really bad Hallmark greeting card poetry. I mean, like, in hindsight, but I didn't know that. And so, I wrote my first poem when I was 4 years old. Like I was sitting at my grandmother's table. She was working on a poem and I took it and just sort of like rearranged and I still have it somewhere. My mom has it somewhere in a notebook. So we actually have that. And by the time I was 14 or 15, I think everybody I've ever met who's successful is successful because they're running from something just as fast as they're running towards something. And I think that double motivation is really important to success. I think it's so hard to be successful that if you're just trying to run towards something, oftentimes you don't have enough fire. But if you're running from something at the same time you're running towards something, there's some real fire there. And so, I always like to have success. One of the reasons I'm really successful is I learned early on, I mean, like 14 or 15, how to turn pain into words, right? And that's, I think any great creative, but probably any great successful person finds a way to take emotional pain and turn it into work. And that becomes a very fulfilling thing. So that I learned to do that really early on in high school. Didn't much like high school. Learned to do that early on in high school, and my senior thesis was a collection of poetry. I was a poet till I was out of college. I didn't, my first novel actually was an epic poem. And I sort of wrote the first 110 pages of it. And I was like, well, this is a terrible freaking poem, but I think it's a book. And I'd never written a book before. I had no idea like what that even meant. I was like, okay, let's figure out how to write a book. I mean, like you can get away with a lot of shit as a poet. You don't have to really know the rules of grammar.
right? Like you don't even have to know how to spell, because
Yeah.
you can just call that creative license at a certain level, especially if you're 17 and, arrogant and pugnacious like I was. So, I had to sort of grow up really fast at that point as a writer, because I was like, oh, wow, I have to take this thing and turn it into that thing. And, that's, I think, when it really got mature. And you asked a question about journalism. I came out of even graduate school. I told you I was a poet. Then I became a fiction writer, and that's what my master's degree is in. And I had sort of freelanced. I wasn't like, it was very clear that nobody would hire me. And I had long dreadlocks. I was a weird looking guy. I was a punk rocker, I had earrings. And this is in the late 80s, early 1990s. And nobody hired dudes who looked like me. And I had worked in advertising, actually at a fairly high level, for a company called Foot Cone and Belding. They had never seen me. So like, it was remote. I was working from home, and I'd send in the work and blah, blah, blah. And I got hired by a friend, and like just kept on. He left and I kept the contract. They never met me. So I got out of grad school thinking, oh, I can get a job in advertising. And I walked in to the first meeting, and the guy took one look at me. It was like, there's no way we're hiring you. And, but he threw a magazine at. He liked me, and they didn't have a justification for not hiring me. Right. But it was clear they weren't going to hire me because I looked funny. Right. So he kept trying to get me to leave. And I was like, fuck you. I'm not going anywhere, man. I need a job. And so you're going to have to throw me out. And finally, so we kept going to meetings, trying to be rude. Finally, threw this copy of this magazine. It was called Bikini, which was not about bikinis. It was like the early first of what became the lads magazines, like Maxim, FHM, all those magazines. It was sort of like, it was like the underground sort of punk rock revolution. And they sent me tossed that to me to keep me out of it. And I looked at it and went, oh, this I can do. I read an article by a guy who later became a friend of mine. It was an interview with a guy named Tim Roth. And it was just really like, it's kind of the first wave of like punk rock kind of, in your face journalism. And I looked at it and I went, oh, this I can do. And I stole the dude's magazine, left the office, and called the editor-in-chief every hour on the hour for 4 days straight until he took my call. And then I sort of conned and begged my way into a sort of a job, sort of a tryout. And the editor basically, he listened. I didn't have any magazine experience. I had no journalism experience. So I talked to me, and he was like, well, send me some of your work. And I was like, oh, okay. And so I faxed him like papers from college, and like, some of my poetry, and like the first 50 pages of my novel. Like, I just kept faxing him shit. And like 4 days later, he was like, well, kid, you got chutzpah. I'll give you that. Maybe something will come our way. And he called me up, and it was 2 days later, he was like, I got this crazy story. I need you to get the story. The guy's going to jail on Monday. It's Friday. If you can get the story by Monday, if you can talk an interview with this guy before Monday, I'll give you a job. And I did. I found a way to do it. Luckily, I had friends who were in and out of.
Wow, that's an amazing story. What I like about that is that you were so hungry for it, right? And you talk about the different stages of creativity, and there's like 3 of them. As a creative, like the first stage is like trying to make a name for yourself. Like you gotta hustle. You gotta be hungry, and then a second stage is like, now you got to be creative for someone else. You got to play inside their bubble, right? Like you got to do that. And then once you get out of that, you got to, make a name for yourself. And now you probably have a staff that's probably, feeding off your creative stuff, and you're paying the bills for them essentially. During that time, like you were getting up at like 4 a.m. Like you were 28 years old getting up.
Yeah, no, I mean, it hasn't changed. I've gotten up at 4 a.m. or earlier I've seen the sunrise every day since I was 28, and I'm 53. Yeah, you have to understand that it took me so long to figure out to get into magazines, and I built my career up. I became one of the more successful freelance journalists in my 20s, and then I sort of lost all of it. Right, I spent 10 years getting a dream job, then I got Lyme disease and spent 3 years in bed, and it led me to a lot of stuff. But on the other side of that, I was writing a book called West of Jesus, and it was a book about surfing, which was my great passion, and I had sort of surfed myself back to health after this long illness a little bit, and it was my first book about flow. And I realized very early on as I was writing this, I was like, one, I'm so sick. I could only do a couple things in a day. I could write maybe and do a little work, and I could maybe have a social life, or I could write and go surfing, or write and talk to my family, or like whatever. I had to make very radical choices about my time. And I started realizing that like all I really wanted to do was write and surf, and nothing else mattered. And I got this, I managed to, I bankrupted myself during that period, basically trying to pay for doctor's bills and things like that. And on the backside of it, when I finally sold this book, and I was like, oh my God, I'm getting paid to write and to go and to surf, right? Like, and to study neuroscience. And like, I was like, holy crap, this is exactly what I'm here to do. This is all I'm going to do. And I was like, and I'm going to pour everything into it every second. And so I started by getting up at 4 o'clock in the morning, I gave up a social life. I was like, okay, I'm never going to have sex again. I'm never going to meet a woman. Like, okay, that's fine. Whatever. And it wasn't even about a career as much as, oh my God, I finally got like a little bit of opportunity to do exactly what I came to do. What it felt like I came to do. And if you see that, you know what I mean? If you bump into that, if you're lucky enough to bump into that at any point in your life, you run straight towards that thing with everything you got until something kills you. Because those opportunities, those moments, you get, as far as I can tell in my life, I don't know about other people, but I find one a decade shows up, where there's one moment where you're like, oh, this is a terrifying thing, but it's the thing, and I'm going straight at it, and it'll disappear, it'll vanish. And if you don't go straight at it, those are the things we call regrets, right? And I don't want those.
Yeah. Well, you said you had Lyme's disease, right?
Yeah.
How'd you get that? Was that like a
Tick bite?
Really?
Tick bite. I was at a wedding in upstate New York. Went for a
Jeez.
walk.
And then like you lost everything. I mean, you went bankrupt. You talked about you lost your job, essentially, the woman you were going to marry. Like, I mean, this thing took everything from you. And then
it gave everything to me, though. So it took everything, and then I got new. It gave me new stuff, and I like the new stuff better. So I'm good with that.
But you found out about flow when you were sick, though, right? Like you were seeing a lot of these
Sort of.
extreme sports before that.
Yeah.
Like,
So Trey, before I got sick, when I started out as a journalist, one of the things I really covered was action sports: surfing, skiing, rock climbing. And as I wrote about in Rise to Superman, during the 1990s, there was this explosion in peak performance in the world of action sports, right? Stuff, impossible feats, stuff that had never been done before, was never going to be done, was like being done on a daily, weekly, basis. It didn't make any sense. And it was every sport, every action sport. We just saw progression went through the roof. It didn't even make any sense. And so I was trying to answer the question of what the hell is going on, right? Where is all this impossible heightened performance coming from, right? I kept seeing impossible feats being done, and it really caught my attention. You'll notice the same sort of Coventry story, and there's a theme here. The people in action sports and the people who actually became my friends, most of the people in the early 1990s, this is a like punk rock, rowdy, irreverent group of people, right? These are not your like normal Olympic athletes that you see, that, you know what I mean? Like the people I knew, most of them had terrible childhoods, broken homes, very little education, almost no money. And yet here they were, like on a regular basis, reinventing what was possible for our species at a level like we had never seen before. And the journalists who were covering it, we used to talk about it all the time, like there's got to be a limit. It's going to stop. There's no way it can keep going. And the other side of it, like, holy crap, like, how is it possible that these people, the same group of that society would tell you were massively disadvantaged, that are going to be dead by the time they're 30, that nobody would bet on, right? Losers from any normal perspective, were reinventing what was possible for our species. Like that was a phenomenon that really had my attention. When I got sick, it was surfing, and surfing started producing these profound, wild, altered states of consciousness that I now know were flow states that have huge immune system boosting properties and huge performance properties as well. That got me back to health. And what happened is when I came out the other side and I was trying to figure out, well, how the hell is surfing, right, why am I healthy again after like these weird altered state experiences that are produced by surfing? That doesn't make any sense. And I'm a science writer and a science guy also, trying to figure it out. I started to figure out, first of all, oh, there's science here. These states are called flow states, and they boost the immune system and they reset the nervous system. And that's why they're useful against autoimmune conditions like Lyme. But simultaneously, the same state that helped me go seriously subpar back to normal, I was helping normal people go all the way up to Superman. And that was what happened. So I had seen it. I just didn't know it was called flow. I knew it was something because people talked about it. You know what I mean? They just used, it was funny because I always tell this story. Like, I remember meeting Laird Hamilton, the big wave surfer, probably for the first time. We were 20. I was about 27 at the time. He was maybe 30, 31. And I was writing a story for ESPN. And the funniest thing about the story, we laugh about it now, because the story was called Grandpa's, because Laird was supposedly over the hill at 31, right? It was Tony Hawk, Laird Hamilton, and Sean Palmer. Now, mind you, Tony Hawk hadn't yet thrown the 900. Like he didn't have a video game yet, right? Like all this stuff. He was over the hill. Laird had, was about to change 4 different sports forever. But Laird was describing flow back then, and he was using what I thought was like this crazy weirdo spiritual language that when you go there, it's always the same. It is, and you are, and that's it. Stuff like that. Now, in hindsight, I realize he's giving me an absolutely like scientifically accurate, literal description of what goes on in flow. But at the time, I was like, what's up with this new age fruitcake, dude? Like, I know he's the toughest guy on earth, but like, what kind of flowery, like, what are you talking about, dude? The you are and it is. I mean, shut up, man. Right. And later I was like, it took me about 5 years of science research to realize I was the total asshole in that situation. And Laird was being totally righteous. Right. But it took a little while for me to learn that. But so that was sort of where it really began, my adult career, you could say.
Well, how do you all right, so how do you earn the respect of like the neuroscience community? Like, I mean, you said it took you 5 years of researching data, right? Like, I mean, how do you do that?
So I always tell this to people in different contexts. A lot of people I think want to be quote unquote thought leaders today. And apparently I am one. So people come and ask me, how did you get here? Right. And what they really mean, what most of them, if you're going to ask me the question, mostly the answer you want is, well, this is how I got famous on Instagram in a year. And that's not an answer I've got for you. I don't know. I wrote 12 books and started a neuroscience research company. Like, that's what I did. I don't know what, but my point on that is I went very, very, very slowly. I started my first company, not the Flow Research Collective, but the company I was co-founder of before. It wasn't even by choice. I had been studying the neuroscience of flow. Everybody else was concerned with the psychology, but because A, I was interested in neuroscience and writing about it, and B, the book that introduced me to the idea of flow didn't really talk about the psychology. It talked about neuroscience. So it took me, I learned the neuroscience 5 or 6 years before I actually realized, oh, wow, there's an entire body of psychological work around flow. I was already interested in this thing that the flow psychologists really were not interested in. So, and if you went into the neuroscience, you quickly figured out that, oh, wow, there's a whole team of people working on neuroelectricity, what's called brainwaves, right? There's a whole bunch of other people over here, and they're working on neurochemicals, right? Things like dopamine or endorphins and serotonin you hear about involved with SSRIs and, addictive behavior and things like that. And then there's other people who are concerned with anatomy, like where in the brain it's taking place. And there's a whole other group over here who's interested in networks, because it's never just one place in the brain, it's a bunch of different places, and they're not even talking to each other. So I became the guy who would go talk to the neuroelectricity guy, and then I'd go over here and I'd talk to the neurochemistry guy, and then I'd go talk to the woman who was doing some psychology over here, and the woman who was doing some psychology over here, and then and nobody else was doing it. And I did that for 15 to 18 years and kept writing about it and kept writing about it and kept writing about it. And then I wrote a column for Psychology Today about, I did a lot of work. And after about 18 years of me trying to convince neuroscientists inside of academic institutions to start dedicated flow research centers, a bunch of people. It started with a guy named Dr. Andrew Hessel, who's actually a biologist, synthetic biologist. I was at Singularity University. I was writing Abundance, my book Abundance, that I wrote with Peter Diamandis. And I was just sitting on a bench, and Andrew Hessel, I didn't really know very well, walked up and sat down. And he's sort of a radical cancer researcher. Right now he runs the Human Genome Right Project. So you've heard about the Human Genome Project that mapped our DNA code. That's round one. Round two is the write. We learned how to read our DNA. Now we're going to try to write DNA. That's what he's now in charge of that. But he had to do all this work. He was in academia at Amgen. He did everything by the book. And then he went, oh, wow, I can't do the shit I want to do inside. I got to take it outside. So I was talking to him about all my problems, like, hey, how come I can't? And he was like, dude, you just can't do it. He said, but he said, you're clearly the world's expert on this. And if you do this, I'll join your team. I'll join your board and I'll help. And he's like, I'll bet if you call 3 or 4 other, and he listed a bunch of neuroscience friends of ours and asked them if they would, and he was like, everybody's been waiting for you to do this. And I was like, oh, okay, maybe they think I know more, right? I was really cautious. I sort of let everybody else, point at me. I tell my team, one of the problems I think with, we see a lot of this today is, in my opinion, it's got to be like, you have your idea, you do your research, you write your book, you publish your book, then you get to talk about it. And the reason you have to publish before you get to talk about it is so other people can read your work and say, I agree, I disagree, here's why, you're stupid, you're smart, right? In science, it's peer-reviewed process, and journalism, blah, blah. But what we see a lot of today is people they get the idea and then they get on stage and start talking about it. And nobody can evaluate their idea, and they want to get famous for being on, and it doesn't work that way. So I always tell the people who work for me, I'm like, have all the ideas you want, do all the research you want, but you have to put it down on paper and put it into this public sphere so other people can weigh in before you get to claim expert status on a stage. Sure. Right. And even when you get on a stage, the first thing any expert will tell you is, the smarter I get, the dumber I get. Right. Isn't that the truth in every field, right? Yeah. That's what experts know. Oh my God, there is so much I don't know.
I think you're the great example of you don't have to go get your doctorate in neuroscience, but it made you curious. So you followed your curiosity, and now look at you. Now you're a thought leader on Flow. You've created these 2, great companies. And you're helping others, kind of facilitate flow in their lives, maybe not creating flow for them, but you're kind of, creating the conditions.
No, I don't, we train over 1,000 people a month, and we keep doing it. So clearly, apparently it works, right? You know what I mean? We got data, so I always say, but it's not just, I don't think it's us. I think it's the neuroscience, right? Neuroscience, the reason neuroscience matters, the reason anybody listening to this should give that I'm talking
Go
about.
ahead, Cuss. Go ahead. You can say fuck.
Is, thank you. It's mechanism, right? Psychology, it's soft, it's squishy, it's behaved maybe it works this way, but neuroscience is look, the gas goes in here, the spark plug ignites it, it does, right? You're oh, that's how the shit works. I get it, right? I'm really that's how my brain works. I'm a sort of a gear guy. I want to know what are the steps and how does it work? And it's a physical system. And it's funny because the brain seems enormously complicated, but anybody who knows how an engine runs, once you break it down to really small parts, you're oh, it's the same kinds of processes. I'm oh, okay, I get it. And that's why neuroscience matters, right? So by using the neuroscience, we took this thing that wasn't particularly trainable and made it very, very trainable, right? And I've seen it in my own work. When we started this work early on, it was 2013 was the first time I was okay, let's try to train this. And our hit rate was okay. By 2015, we were, after 6 to 8 weeks, we could get a 35 to 40, 50% boost in flow. And then there could be a big substantial return to baseline, to average again afterwards. Now it's a 70 to 80% boost in flow. We'll still see people sort of, flow. It turns out flow is really easy to teach. You have to have certain motivational skills and certain grit skills. You have to know how to learn also, because flow requires using your skills to the utmost. So if you don't have really good, like, how do I learn something processes, you can get into flow on the front end, but you have to keep learning to keep staying in the state. And if you don't really know how to learn super well, you're going to hit walls there. So there's other things that can sort of rot your ability to get into flow. And so there's other things you want to sort of work on at the same time as you train flow to really support it. But it's definitely trainable, and the neuroscience definitely gives us a leg up. At least I think so.
Yeah. Can you talk a little bit about the science behind that? So like, I love listening to this. The basics of flow, like what is happening in your mind when you're going into.
Well, okay, so let's just start with like a technical definition, and then like what is flow, right? What the hell are we talking about? And then I'll break it down for you. So scientists define flow, and you may call it being in the zone or runner's high or being unconscious or being in the pocket. The lingo is really sort of endless. Flow is the scientific term, and all it means is it's an optimal state of consciousness where we feel our best and we perform our best. And everybody's had this experience. It's any of those moments of total absorption in what you're doing. You're so focused on the task at hand that everything else just seems to vanish, right? Your sense of self gets really quiet. Time passes strangely. It'll speed up. 5 hours will go by in like 5 seconds, or it'll slow down and you'll get a freeze frame effect for maybe you've been in a car crash. And throughout all aspects of performance, mental and physical, go through the roof. Okay, great. That's flow. When psychologists define flow, they define it according to, there are 6 characteristics. They're technically phenomenological characteristics, which technically means this is how the state makes you feel. So when you're in flow, and I mentioned some of these a second ago, there's complete concentration on the task at hand. There's this vanishing of self. Time passes strangely, a couple other conditions, right? So these 6 conditions, if they show up during experience, oh, cool, we call it flow. And how much these 6 experiences show up during a given experience, that's how we measure flow. Underneath all that psychology, there's a bunch of neurobiological changes. And I'm just going to focus on, as I said, if you want to talk about what's going on in the brain, there's 4 things you really talk about. You talk about neurochemistry and neuroelectricity. These are the 2 ways the brain talks to itself, right? Their communication. How does the brain talk to itself? How does it talk to the body? Neurochemicals or electrical signals, chemical signals or electrical signals, and neural anatomy and networks. That's about where in the brain something is taking place. I'm just going to focus on neural anatomy, where, and then we'll talk a little bit about neurochemistry. Neural anatomy, old idea about high performance, is what was called, and everybody listening has heard some version of this, it's the 10% brain myth. It's the idea that we're only using a small chunk of our brain at any one time. So peak performance, when we're at our best, got to be the full brain, right? We're using everything on overdrive. And that's not actually the case. We don't use more of the brain, we use less of the brain. And it's an efficiency exchange. The brain has a fixed amount of energy it can work with at any moment. So when we move into flow, the brain needs a lot of energy to pay attention to the present moment. So it shuts down areas that it doesn't need working at that point and redirects the energy, right? That's essentially what's going on. And what it really does is it shuts down a large portion of your brain that's right behind your forehead. It's called the prefrontal cortex. And this is a part of your brain, it's powerful, right? This is complex, logical decision-making. This is long-term planning. Your sense of morality lives there. Your sense of willpower also lives there. In flow, these things aren't crucial. So this portion of the brain gets quiet. And the technical term is transient, meaning temporary. Hypo, H-Y-P-O, is the opposite of hyper. It means to slow down. Frontality, the prefrontal cortex, the part of your brain that's right behind the forehead, right? So in flow, this portion of the brain gets quiet. This is why does time pass so strangely in flow, right? What's that about? Time is a calculation performed all over the front of the brain. And as we move into flow and this portion of the brain shuts down, there's a couple other things that mess with time, but one of the main ones is this, it's sort of a network. Time calculation is a network, and the prefrontal cortex shuts down. It's like any network, right? You pull off enough nodes, your internet goes down. Same thing with your ability to calculate time, separate past from present from future. Big deal for performance, right? If you think about most of the stuff that fear is the biggest problem for performance, mostly. And most of the stuff that scares you is either scary stuff that happened in the past, you'd like to avoid it happening again in the present, or it's scary stuff that could happen in the future. You want to steer around it from the present. If I remove past and future, unless you're a soldier in a combat environment or an MMA guy in the ring or an action sport athlete at the top of a 100-foot wave, you're probably not in a life-threatening situation. And you don't, right? So what happens is stress hormones get flushed out of your system. This was the big deal with Lyme disease. Like, how the hell does flow and surfing cure Lyme disease? Any autoimmune condition is a nervous system gone haywire, right? It's like your nervous system is having an epileptic fit all over the place. And part of the problem, and anybody who's been sick for a long time is going to be able to totally relate to this. Your body, it's a homeostatic mechanism, right? It wants to go back to sort of normal baseline, whatever. But if you're sick for a really long time, your body doesn't know where normal is anymore. So when you move into flow and all these stress hormones get flushed out of your system and it resets your nervous system to zero, if you're coming out of a long illness, it's really beneficial because you're retraining your brain and your body. Hey, this is normal. This is how you're supposed to feel, right? And that sounds like a simple thing, but like when you can't find normal, it's not, like, it's awful. And so flow was really helpful for that. That's how I ended up sort of curing myself of Lyme disease partially with this mechanism.
Wow. There's like 6 chemicals associated with that, right? Like, that's why you feel like this.
Let me clarify that. There's 200 and some odd neurochemicals in the brain. 50 or so of them are really understood to some level. There are, that we know of, a good 9 or so, 10 that are probably involved in flow in a significant way. There are 5 or 6 that you're referring to that get all the attention because they're the feel-good chemicals, right? They're the pleasure chemicals. Flow is the most addictive experience on earth. We know this. It's people's favorite experience on earth. If you ask people, what do you like the most, period, we like flow the most. And that pleasure is the same performance enhancing benefits come from 5 or 6 of these different neurochemicals. So I'll give you a couple examples just from a pleasure perspective. So 2 of the chemicals you get in flow are dopamine and norepinephrine. These are pleasure chemicals. We feel them as excitement. In flow, they help enhance focus, right? So they drive, but them as, that this cocktail is romantic love. Fallen in love before, right? That incredible giddy, I can't stop thinking about her, him, it, she, my dog, whatever it is that you're falling in love with, it's norepinephrine and dopamine. And so those are 2 of the pleasure chemicals you get in flow, plus 4 or 5 more, depending if you're with other people in the experience or not, or if you're alone. That'll also impact the chemicals. When you get all 6, that includes oxytocin, the so-called trust cuddle chemical, but that appears to only show up when other people are involved in the experience with you, and there's a group flow experience or things like that. If you're by yourself and you drop into flow, we don't think you get oxytocin. It doesn't seem to be a way to get into your system.
Well, you talked about like soldiers going across, going into war and then having that stronger relationship with their brothers as opposed to their wives because they're experiencing flow, which is more chemicals than when you fall in love.
Exactly. Yeah, you see it with action sport athletes too. Laird Hamilton mentioned this. We talked about this a lot. So the relationship, when they tow surf, they do it in pairs, right? And one person rides a jet ski, the other person surfs. And the person on the jet ski, they've got the surfer's life in their hands, right? Like if the surfer wipes out and they don't come back. So they end up not only do they get crazy flow experiences from the surfing, they also get a lot of those same chemicals from we're saving each other's life, scenarios. And what they end up with relationships that are tighter than their relationships to their wives. And I remember talking about Larry's married to Gabby Reese. And I've had this conversation with Gabby too.
That's awesome, dude. I don't know. It's so crazy, man. I just love flow. I love everything about it. Do you still have to reframe? Like you were talking about this before, like before you get up and speak, you feel like you feel that anxiety, and you said there's a method that you can use. I actually have it up on my whiteboard. You have to say you're excited 3 times and
yeah. So there's a bunch of different ways you can do it. So I'll talk about 2 different ways. So how do you calm your nervous system down in the moment, right? The simplest way is, so if you inhale, fill up your lungs, and when you totally fill it, and then you go take in more oxygen. If you do that right now, if anybody does that at home, you'll feel that extra sip of oxygen, it sort of like whites out everything in your brain, right? It just erases it. That is, and this isn't my work. This is Dr. Andrew Huberman's work at Stanford, who's really done a lot of this work on respiration, the nervous system. That's the fastest sort of way to calm yourself down. What you're talking about is cognitive reframing. So how we think, context, how we think about an experience often determines that experience. And so the example you were talking about is in the body, norepinephrine, one of the two chemicals we were just talking about under romantic love, it's either anxiety or excitement, same exact chemical. In fact, certain mammalian species, like if you go back in the chain to like cows, for example, cows can only feel excitement or anxiety. It's like a switch goes on and off. It's one or the other. Humans were a little better at mixing them. We can sort of like excited curiosity, anxiety, like that we can weave them together, but we're not really good at it. And so they did this experiment at Harvard. They were like, okay, we want to know if I got to calm somebody down, is it better if we do 5 minutes of slow, deep breathing, not doing the inhale I just taught you, not doing that, but just like 5 second inhales, 5 second exhales for, how long versus a reframing technique. So they tested it. And the reframing technique was literally think about the thing that's scaring you and say out loud, as you just pointed out, I am excited, I am excited, I am excited 3 times in a row versus deep breathing. And it sounds like the stupidest thing you've ever heard, right? I mean, like, seriously, I am excited, I am excited, I am excited out loud 3 times. This is like, you're kidding, right? And Santa Claus is going to come down the chimney with Girl Scout cookies. But it turns out, actually, here's your Girl Scout cookies, right? Like, it actually works. So yeah, you can sort of reframe stuff. There's a couple other steps is, if you're up against something like COVID-19, you know what I mean? You're not going to reframe COVID-19 with I am excited, I am excited, I am excited, right? But the other thing is that excitement works really, really, really well if you couple it with, prior memories of positive success, right? Like this is work. Mike Gervais has done a lot of this work, the sports psychologist who works with the Seattle Seahawks. Really kind of like the best thing, some of the best performance advice. Most people don't trust their own history. Like, I don't care who you are. You could be the most colossal fuck up in the history of the world. There's still shit you're good at, even if it's only getting into trouble, right? Like, you've got certain skills just to survive. You develop them. And a lot of them are invisible, right? Like, one of the things, because I grew up in Cleveland in this big melting pot culture, at Coventry with a big melting pot of people, and because I was a bartender, and I was bartender in rough neighborhoods where you had to really you got to get along with everybody. Because look, I'm 100. When I graduated high school, I was a lot skinnier. I'm still $160, soaking wet, and 5'10". So I'm scrappy, and you don't necessarily want to mess with me. But come on, right? Like, I was working at steel mill bars and biker bars and things like these guys were going to kill me. So I learned to talk to a lot of people, is my point. I learned to respect a lot of people and listen to a lot of people and talk to a lot of people and like a lot of people. And that's an invisible skill. No employer is going to, it's not going to show up on anything anybody's ever measuring, but you can drop me into the middle of anywhere in the world, and I'm going to make friends very quickly. Because of, right, that's an invisible skill. And so you have to trust your history. You have to look back over your life and be like, where are situations where I encountered this anxiety before and I triumphed? Maybe you've never spoken on a public stage before, but you've certainly walked to the dinner table and pitched your wife and kids an idea that maybe, you know what I mean? Like, maybe you didn't know how they were going to react and you sold it and it worked. Like, everybody's got something, right? even if you don't got that, you've got the time that you convinced 4 of your friends to go see the movie that nobody wanted to see. And it turns out it was a great, like, you've all got something. So like that kind of stuff coupled to it is also really, contextual reframing is really powerful, but if you can anchor it in, oh, this thing that really happened to me, there's also some more energy there too.
That's awesome. How can people connect with you? How can people find out more about flow?
So gift for all your listeners, for sure. If you go to www.flowresearchcollective.com/flow blockers, right? FLOW blockers. So there are about 10 different things that really normally block flow for most people. There's probably more, but 10, we've identified 10 big ones. And by we, I mean the field of flow researchers. 10 big things have been identified. I think lots of different people have contributed. So we built a diagnostic for it, and anybody can take it and it'll just look over your life and say, hey, this is the thing you're doing. Stop doing that. And it'll give you ways to do that. So that's free. You can go to flowresearchcollective.com. There's tons of free videos, podcasts, anything you possibly want, or stephenkotler.com. Same thing, tons of free stuff. And check, if you go to stephenkotler.com, if you're curious about this stuff, go to the tab that says the rabbit hole, because there's basically playlists of like articles or podcasts or short video clips or whatever. So whatever you're, curious about, there's a rabbit hole for you.
Awesome, man. Yeah, I highly suggest everybody go to Creative Live and watch your training there. Like, I love it. Like, it's probably the most important investment I've made as a creative, just to kind of learn the science behind it, and some of the bonus footage that you have at the end about curiosity is huge, and it's helped me along the way.
No, thank you.
Last question, man. What do you want your legacy to be?
That's funny. Because I don't ever think in those, I don't really think in those terms. You know what I mean? Like I never actually think about those terms. I'm excited that I get the opportunity to write books that impact the world, right? The fact that I get to write for a living and it makes an impact. I always wanted to, really, really, really be part of the group of people. I don't, it doesn't have to just be me, but I want to be part of the group of people who really totally decode the neurobiology of flow, like exactly how this works. How do we get more like that? That's really important to me. And most of the work, my wife and I, have been involved with animal work and dog sanctuary work and dog rescue and animal rescue and conservation. And, so I, if I can make the world a better place for animals along the way, that's, people are always like, oh my God, the flow stuff, you're helping so many people. And I'm like, that's great, maybe, but like, that's not like, I wanted more flow for me and my friends. Like, don't ever think this is about like some altruistic whatever. Like, I wanted more of this happy drug for me, my friends, and it's just a puzzle. I like puzzles, right? I'm super, super, super motivated. The stuff that I do that, like, legacy wise, yeah, if I can make the world a better place for animals and the environment, yeah, that's something, that's a legacy that, extends beyond, beyond me and beyond the flow stuff and beyond the human species. Cause I'm not super impressed with us. Like I'm impressed with individuals, and I'm an optimist in general, but Art of Impossible, the book I have coming out in January, is about how anybody can take on impossible challenges. In fact, more and more, the research seems to support this. It seems like we humans are built for it. And when we don't do that, like, it's really weird, but I make this argument in the book. It's not the same argument, but a lot of people have noticed it lately and pointed it out. They're like, are you really saying this? And I'm like, yeah, I kind of am, because it's there in the science, which is, if we don't try to go big, we pay for that with anxiety and depression. And like a lot of the so-called diseases of the modern world are really diseases of we're designed for peak performance. We're designed to go hard and go big as human beings. I'm like, seriously, and not doing that, sort of settling for average and when we're capable of extraordinary, that sort of seems like a death sentence. That's what the research really sort of points to a lot. So, you know, I'm impressed when the people I always say that, like, I like the leading 10% who are out there pushing forward, and I like the trailing 10% because I come out of that community, the people who've gotten their ass kicked so badly, right? Like, everybody who's sort of in the middle, okay, I'm glad you like the middle, and that's cool, and I get it. It's hard here. It's hard for everybody. If you're just like cool where you're at, that's great. But like, I sort of like the edges of the spectrum. I'm a weird dude that way, but
I'm the same way as you, man. Like, I can't, I have to continuously push myself, or else I feel like life is, you know, futile. Like, I just don't feel like I'm doing anything, right? Like, I've tried to, like, you know, my wife's always like, why are you always trying to push the envelope? Why are you always trying to push the boundaries? And I'm just like, it's just my DNA. I don't know. Like, I just do it. I feel like creativity, and this is like the biggest question that I want a lot of people to like ask themselves, like, that are creatives. Like, think about how creativity has saved your life. And you said this in the course, and it really hit home with me because it was like, how has creativity saved my life? It has given me something to push for, like, to continuously get better at and push my boundaries. And it gives me something to work for. How has creativity saved your life?
Oh yeah. I mean, devotion to craft, whatever the craft is, right? For me, you know, it's either dog work or writing work or skiing work, usually, you know, or flow research, right? Those are the crafts that get most of my attention. But like, that ability to like really focus in on the thing I'm doing and get better and try to do it in a slightly different way and a slightly better way. I always say that, like, you know, for example, you know, I've written about 12 books, and each one of them has a visible challenge, right? Like, I got to communicate this idea, or I got to tell this story in a way that's fun for the reader, whatever. But other than there's a creative challenge, right? Like, Bold, I swear to God, I'm not making this up. Bold is a business book, right? It's about people harnessing disruptive accelerating technology and using some of the flow stuff we've been talking about, some other human performance stuff, to really build kind of world-changing companies. And how do you do that? And sure, I was interested in that idea, and Peter Diamandis and I wrote the book together. It was fun, and I liked the idea, but I really wanted to write a business book that didn't suck. Every business book I've ever read they're the dumbest thing in the world. I'm like, this, not only was it written by a moron, like, you're treating me like I'm a moron. Like, every business book I've ever read is talking down to the reader in some way, or like, I was just like, no, man, like, I want to write a business book that doesn't suck. And so every one of the books that I've written has that kind of challenge baked into it. And I love that kind of, you know what I mean? I always tell people, jokingly, but I'm also deadly serious, which is I want to be the best writer in the world, period, bar none, number one. And I get that that's not a title. Like, you can't actually, there is no best. You probably couldn't even make a list of a top 1,000, top 5,000. Like, it doesn't work like that. There's no heavyweight writing title. I don't care. I'm actually that competitive about, like, creative self-expression. I just come at it with everything, because it is everything. And it is, you know, if your craft is not your salvation, I don't know how you survive here. I'd like that, honestly. Like, it is so, life can be so challenging and so painful and so unpleasant. And even when you're doing exactly what you love, right? I mean, one of the, and I deal with this all the time, because our work, a lot of our work is about how do you take top 10%, top 5% and get them to top 1%, right? So, and you see best in the world people who are like, everybody makes the same discoveries. You come to a point when you're, you know, when you realize the thing that you love becomes a prison. And that is like that. And it, you know, there's always, you know, your favorite book, Stealing Fire, for example, that book was the most awful experience I've ever had in my entire life writing that book.
Really?
It was terrible. I hated every minute of it. Was awful and painful and unpleasant. And nothing about that book was rewarding. And other than the fact that, you know, it's sold a gazillion copies and people love it. But so the aftermath has been rewarding, but like, nothing about that book felt like a prison, almost start to finish. I was trying to serve like 6 different masters with that book and solve the problems were very, very hard. It required me to learn to write in a way I'd never actually really written before, because there's a level of information density in that book. It's a denser book than any of my other books, but it's still very readable. So how do you like add in my books are already dense, and like how do you put in another layer and still make it like fun and engaging for the reader? Because for me, as you probably figured out, like if you're going to bother, like you're going to read one of my books, it's going to take at minimum 5 to 6 hours and probably 10. If you're nice enough to give me 6 to 10 hours of your life, it is my job to make sure, like I always tell people, it's got to be fun as hell and it's got to blow your mind. Otherwise I haven't done my job. Like it's got to do both. Cause I don't want you to have to slog through 10. If you have to be bored for 10 hours and it's constantly just taking medicine.
Yeah.
That sucks. I don't like it as a reader. You know what I mean?
Yeah.
I like it as a reader when it's a textbook, right? I read textbooks a lot, and that's okay. You don't have to it doesn't have to be a good story. Just give me the freaking facts. I'm cool with that, right? Like I'm cool. That's why it's a textbook. But other than that, if you're actually like calling yourself a writer and you're wading into the arena, you're in an engaged medium, and you're competing with, Dave Chappelle on Netflix, and Dave's funny.
Yeah.
Well,
the one thing that you just, you said that really just kind of shook me a little bit was, each book is like 10 or 11 years of someone's life, like your life, right? Like when I pick up a book, like you write an article, it could be like an hour or two of your life. But when I pick up a book like Stealing Fire, that's value right there. That's like someone's life for like 10 years of their work. And that's just like phenomenal to me.
Yeah, you're talking about the thing you're talking about is in it's called the return on investment on reading, right? It's in The Art of Impossible. Finally, I'm going to publish this. But people always say, oh God, I'm too busy to read a book. Maybe I'll read a magazine, or I'll listen to a lecture, that sort of stuff. And maybe, but not if you actually knew the math, right? Like I always say, if you read a blog of mine, what it takes for me to write a blog is about 4 or 5 hours of research, a couple of conversations with a couple of people, and then like 3 or 4 hours of writing, right? That's what you get. You get about a day's worth of work in my brain. If you read a magazine article, say something I wrote for Wired or the Atlantic Monthly that was 5,000-6,000 words long, it takes you about 25 minutes to read. So the blog takes you 5 minutes to read. The article takes you 25 minutes to read. So your time goes up 5x, right? But what about my time? Well, if I'm writing a magazine article for the Atlantic Monthly, for example, it was probably 3 to 6 months to report the article. And then it was another 3 to 6 months to write it, go over it with fact checkers, go over it with editors, re-report it. So you got, in the end, 6 months to a year of my time. So my time, went from a day to a year, right? So, and you did 5 times more work. I did 365 times more work. And if you go to a book, as Rise of Superman being the big example, maybe one of them, there's 15 years worth of research in there, right? Like 15 years of hardcore work. And luckily, a lot of that work, stuff I've written before elsewhere. So I sort of knew how to write about it clearly. Like you got craft work and intellectual stuff. And it takes you 5-6 hours to read Rise of Superman. But let's say you're a fast reader. If I was reading Rise, it would take, at the rate I read, it would take about 5 hours to read it. So my time, just went up. It went up 20x, or your time went up 20x. But you're getting 15 years of my life. You just you can't beat that. That's a value proposition you can't beat.
Yeah, man. This hour has been, this has been the most valuable hour for me. I mean, just getting to know you and more. And I appreciate you taking your time. I know we're a little over, but thank you for coming on the show, Steve. And this has been amazing.
It's my pleasure. It's funny. I got to get off the phone with you, or the podcast with you, to go get on a call with Joe, which is where we met.
No shit. That's awesome. Well, tell him I said hi.
I will.
I want to say thank you to Stephen for joining the show. I want to say thank you to you, the listener, for downloading this episode. Please check me out on all social media. Hit like, subscribe to this podcast, wherever we get your podcast from. It helps me scale the show. And I really hope you guys enjoyed this interview. I enjoyed it. Please let me know how flow has changed your life. How has creativity saved your life? That is like, I keep going back to that question because it's such an interesting question. How has creativity saved your life? I want to know the answer. So go to traydowns.com. Let me know. How has creativity saved your life? Guys, thank you so much. I hope you enjoy your week. Peace and love, and I'll talk to you later.